Welcome everyone to Bodhi Unified Flow. We're absolutely thrilled to have you here. Our whole mission is to simplify the complex and help you amplify your performance. In today's Masterclass Explainer, we're doing a deep dive into the foundations of behavioral change and constructing a daily practice, specifically focusing on habit formation. We'll be looking at Part 4, consistency, neuroplasticity, and the actual biology behind the 21-day and 90-day cycles. Let me just say, if you've ever felt frustrated because a new habit just wouldn't stick, I want you to know right now, it is very likely not a failure of your willpower. Not at all. It's simply a misunderstanding of your own neurobiology. So let's clear that up today.
Here is our roadmap for today. First, we'll be debunking the famous 21-day myth. Second, we'll get into the actual neuroscience of habits. Third, we'll trace the journey from the prefrontal cortex to the basal ganglia. Fourth, we'll break down the biology of consistency. And finally, number 5, we'll put it all together by constructing a daily practice.
By the end of our session together, here's exactly what you're going to walk away with. You'll understand the true, scientifically backed biological timeline of how habits actually form. You'll grasp the nuts and bolts, the cellular mechanisms like neuroplasticity and myelination that make lasting change possible. You'll discover how to literally shift your behaviors onto autopilot inside the basal ganglia. And most importantly, you'll be able to apply concrete scientific strategies to build a highly consistent daily practice in your own life.
Okay, let's jump straight into Section 1, debunking the 21-day myth and uncovering the truth about habit timelines.
I want us to question everything we've probably been told about building habits. If you walk up to just about anyone on the street and ask, hey, how long does it take to form a habit? They will almost certainly give you this exact number, 21, right? We've all heard it. But where in the world did this come from? Well, it actually started way back in 1960 with a plastic surgeon named Dr. Maxwell Maltz in his book Psychocybernetics. Now, Dr. Maltz simply noticed that it took his patients roughly 21 days to get used to their new reflection in the mirror after facial surgery or to adjust to losing a limb. This was purely an observation about psychological adjustment to a physical change. It had absolutely zero to do with building automated behavioral habits from scratch. Yet somehow, the self-help industry took this specific surgical observation and just ran with it, turning it into a universal law.
To find the real number, we have to look past the self-help books and look at actual clinical data. This brings us to a brilliant study by Dr. Philippa Lawley and her team at University College London. They tracked 96 people who were trying to build a new daily habit. Things like drinking a glass of water with lunch or going for a daily run. The researchers watched to see exactly when the behavior hit a plateau of automaticity, meaning it just happened on autopilot. The results? It definitely didn't take 21 days. It actually took a median of 66 days. And here's the wild part. Depending on how complex the habit was, that timeline ranged anywhere from 18 days all the way up to a staggering 254 days for new behavior to truly become a reflex.
So, what does this all mean for us? Because of this massive variation, biologically speaking, you absolutely must plan for a 90-day cycle. If you go in expecting permanent results in just 21 days, you are going to get frustrated and quit right when your brain is actually starting to do the heavy lifting. Planning for 90 days is biologically necessary because true habit formation requires deep structural consolidation in your brain. It's not just about, making a mental commitment. It is a literal physical construction project happening inside your head. And construction just takes time.
Which leads us perfectly into Section 2, the neuroscience of habits, where we look at how we rewire the brain's infrastructure. Let's look under the hood at the specific biological machinery that makes behavior change possible. It all starts with a concept you might be familiar with, neuroplasticity. This is simply your brain's remarkable ability to fundamentally reorganize itself. It forms brand new structural neural connections based entirely on your repeated daily experiences. I really want you to stop thinking about learning a habit as just some abstract psychological concept. Start viewing it as physical tissue adaptation. When you repeatedly think, feel, or do something, your brain is actively laying down brand new physical wiring.
Let's zoom in a bit and see how this builds at the microscopic level through something called long-term potentiation, or LTP. Whenever you repeat an action, the tiny little gaps between your neurons, those are your synapses, they actually strengthen. Every single repetition you do makes the chemical signal between those specific neurons louder and significantly faster. And the fuel driving this? Dopamine. But here's the kicker. It's not just dopamine as a reward after you do the thing. Anticipatory dopamine spikes actually flag a behavior as worth repeating. It's essentially your brain's way of shouting, hey, pay attention, strengthen this exact synaptic gap right now.
But your brain doesn't just stop at the synapses. It upgrades the entire highway. It does this through activity-dependent myelination. Myelin is this fatty, protective sheath that wraps around the long extensions of your neurons. With consistent repetition, specialized cells in your brain actually wrap more and more of this myelin around that specific neural circuit. Think of it like this. Your new habit starts off as a slow, muddy path through a dense forest. It's clumsy, it takes effort, you're tripping over roots. But through activity-dependent myelination, that muddy path is literally paved over into a wide, clear, high-speed neural highway. Highly myelinated pathways can transmit electrical signals up to 100 times faster. This, right here, is the exact biological moment a behavior becomes who you are.
Moving right along to Section 3, prefrontal cortex to basal ganglia. This is all about shifting the cognitive load.
Once that neural highway is built, your brain achieves its ultimate goal, conserving massive amounts of energy. This contrast here brilliantly illustrates the entire transition of habit formation. When you first start a new behavior, it lives in the prefrontal cortex. That's the area right behind your forehead. It requires intense conscious effort, it completely drains your metabolic energy, and honestly, it's incredibly fragile. It gets easily fatigued by stress and cortisol. But as you repeat the behavior over and over, the workload physically shifts deep down into the center of the brain, to the basal ganglia. Now, the basal ganglia operates with pure automaticity, it uses very little energy, and it is highly resilient to stress. So the whole goal of habit formation is simply moving an action out of the exhausting prefrontal cortex and down into the highly efficient basal ganglia.
We can actually map this transition across 4 distinct stages. Stage 1 is initiation, those first 21 days where every single action is highly deliberate and heavily taxes your prefrontal cortex. Stage 2 is learning, where your brain starts recognizing the pattern. But I want you to pay very close attention to Stage 3, stability. This usually hits around weeks 3 to 5. Researchers identify this as the vulnerability window. Why? Because the initial excitement and novelty have completely worn off, but the behavior hasn't yet reached the automated basal ganglia in Stage 4. Your brain is in a metabolic deficit here. It feels hard. But if you understand that this dip is just a temporary biological phase and absolutely not a personal failure, you can push through to day 66 and beyond, where true automaticity finally takes over.
All right, Section 4, the biology of consistency. Let's talk about why every single repetition matters so much.
So, why is daily repetition the absolute only way to get through that vulnerability window? Well, this brings us to what is perhaps the most fascinating mechanism we'll discuss today: epigenetic gating. Deep inside your neurons, your DNA is tightly coiled up. In order for permanent structural brain changes to happen, specific genes need to be unlocked and transcribed. However, you have these molecular gatekeepers, repressor proteins known as HDAC3 and HDAC5 that literally block this from happening. Sporadic occasional effort is just not enough to move them. Only consecutive daily repetitions can generate the sustained chemical cascades required to physically push these repressors out of the way. Think about that for a second. Consistency literally uncoils your DNA to unlock permanent behavioral transformation. Absolutely mind-blowing.
Now, I know what you're thinking. We're human. Perfection is a myth. That's why this quote from Dr. Lawley's UCL study is so incredibly liberating. The clinical data clearly shows that missing a single day has no measurable impact on the overall habit formation process. Your new neural pathway doesn't just instantly shatter because you slept in once. However, the research also shows that missing 2 or 3 days in a row, that causes that fledgling neural pathway to actively begin to decay. So the biological rule of thumb is quite clear: never miss twice.
Which brings us to our final part, Section 5, constructing a daily practice. Let's turn all this amazing science into action.
So the crucial point here is, how do we actually apply this? Before you even attempt to build a habit, you absolutely must respect your nervous system. You cannot build a habit from a state of chronic dysregulation. This is dictated by polyvagal theory and what's called your window of tolerance. This is the zone where your nervous system feels regulated, calm, and safe. When you are highly stressed out, cortisol floods your system and physically shuts down the prefrontal cortex, which is the exact brain region you need online to initiate a new habit. It forces your brain into pure survival mode. So you must actively manage your stress to stay within this window, otherwise your brain simply will not encode those new automatic patterns. Assuming you're operating from within that window of tolerance, here are 3 highly actionable steps to construct your practice. Step 1. Redesign your environment. Let's be real. Willpower is incredibly fragile, but environmental cues are strong.
Make the good choice practically frictionless. Step 2, utilize habit stacking. The formula here is beautifully simple. When I do my current habit, then I will do my new habit. For example, when I pour my morning coffee, then I will write down 3 things I'm grateful for. This is neurologically brilliant because you're basically hijacking the highly myelinated infrastructure of an existing routine, rather than building a new one from scratch. And step 3, start ridiculously small. The goal in the very beginning isn't intensity or duration. The only goal is wiring the initiation pathway in the brain. Just get the circuit firing.
Let's quickly summarize the hard, actionable data we've covered today. First, the 21-day rule is completely an observational myth. You've got to biologically plan for 66 to 90-day cycles to allow your brain to physically remodel itself. Second, true habit formation is defined by that energetic shift from the conscious prefrontal cortex down to the automated basal ganglia. Third, consistency is non-negotiable. It's what drives long-term potentiation at the synapses and white matter myelination along the axons. Remember, missing 1 day is perfectly fine, but missing 2 starts to degrade the pathway. And finally, you have to regulate your nervous system and stay within your window of tolerance if you want neuroplasticity to occur at all.
Now, for those of you who want to geek out and dive a little deeper into the literature, here are the key academic references and core texts we've cited throughout this Bodhi Unified Flow Explainer. We've heavily featured Dr. Lawley's pivotal UCL study, as well as foundational work on epigenetic gating and cortical striatal transitions.
I want to leave you with one final, slightly provocative thought. Your brain is not a static organ, not at all. It is a continuous, 24/7 construction site. The science absolutely proves that it is actively remodeling its physical structure, uncoiling your DNA, and thickening myelin sheaths based entirely on what you repeatedly do. The neurobiology is beautifully responsive to the effort you put in. So, the ultimate question for you is, what neuroarchitecture are you building right now? Thank you so much for joining me for this masterclass explainer. Go out there, build your practice, and I will see you in the next session.